But let's make some progress. Thank you.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I want to ask the Minister about clause 106 of the bill, which, as I understand it, is part of the provisions of the budget which picked the pockets of paperboys. Remember that line that we had in the... because this is the provision that rather than exempting a certain level of income that could be derived by paperboys and girls, by babysitters and the like, the government came along and said, we're so broke as a country, we're going to disincentivise young people getting part-time work by taxing them more. And my understanding, if I'm correct, is that clause 106 of the bill is the bill that gives effect to that by saying that instead of the previous exemption, there is a limited exemption of up to $200 of income per annum. The Uncle Scrooge clause, as Mr Cosgrove describes it. Now, Mr Chairman, I'd be interested if the Speaker could take a call and explain the justification for this, why we've become so miserable in New Zealand. We've become so miserable in New Zealand that the only level of exempt income is limited to $200 per annum. This is in stark contrast to Australia, where the first so many $1,000s of income is not taxable, whoever earns it, rather than the miserable $200 per annum limit that we have under this bill. Mr Speaker, we had this government coming to power on the slogan, say goodbye to higher taxes, not your loved ones. Or they were going to close the wage gap with Australia and decrease the number of people moving from New Zealand to Australia. And in part that was because they said they were going to reduce the tax burden in New Zealand, whereas this bill and this provision in this bill does exactly the opposite. It increases the tax burden on people who are already earning very small amounts of money. So, Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, I would be pleased if the Minister took the next call and indeed told the House that they're not going to proceed with that change to the income tax law, which effectively increases the taxation of young people who've got their small amount of earnings, often irregular amounts of earnings. They often don't have security of income from week to week because their hours can change. And the big tax reform is going to take more money off them. I would also ask another question following up from what Mr Cosgrove asked, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove asked, in respect of where you file returns. My understanding of the provisions in this part of the bill is that you are obliged to disclose if you have received income. And if you haven't received income, well, you're not doing anything wrong to say that you haven't received income. But if you file a tax return that says that you haven't received income when you have, that would be an offence against the Tax Act. One of my colleagues interrupts me and says, "What if you can't remember?" Well, that would be a matter of for the court as to whether they believed you. It wouldn't be for the Minister or for the Prime Minister to pretend to judge whether a claim by someone as to not being able to remember whether they had received income or not. That wouldn't be a decision for the Inland Revenue. They wouldn't accept me if I pretended that I hadn't received income even though I had received cheques in an envelope. I don't think I would be believed. Particularly if I had asked for them or if I'd asked for the income to be split into more than one payment. I would think that it would be very unlikely for the Inland Revenue Department to believe me when I said that I hadn't received income. If I filed a declaration to that effect, I think I would be held to account for my declaration. If I had signed a declaration to that effect, I would be held to account for it. And if I later denied that I was liable for the truthfulness of my declaration because I couldn't remember, I would be doubted And I think that if that were anyone but that were any normal person, the Inland Revenue Department wouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt, and they would say that is a question that, Mr. Chairman,
Honourable David Parker.
that is a question which should be put to a jury rather than the Inland Revenue Department or the police or whoever it is that prosecutes these things, rather than them taking the decision as to whether they believe the unbelievable story. Well, if there were sworn affidavits from people who were involved in the payment of those amounts to me, and they said, I knew I received them, then I would expect that would make it even less likely that I would be believed if I denied that I had received that income. That seems to me to be so obvious that I'm surprised to be asked the question, but I can understand why that surprise is, why there is a level of doubt about that, because that, of course, is exactly the standard that John Banks and the Prime Minister are expecting us to believe in respect of other aspects of the conduct of affairs in this country, and that level of double standard is despicable. It is despicable that someone can stand up in this House in respect of other legislation and say that they have no responsibility for a lapse of memory. They don't have to account to them, to Parliament or to others, for the lack of credibility. They don't have to respond to the statements by other people which cast into doubt the unbelievable statements that they're making anyway. And I, Mr. Speaker, would ask the Minister to take a call and explain the point of principle which is different in respect of taxation legislation, where if I received income and failed to properly declare it for income tax purposes, why there should be a different standard in respect of income tax than is applied to political donations in other parts of the law. Mr. Chairman, we know that different standards are being applied in respect of different areas of the law, because we've seen it in respect of the investigations into the Honourable John Banks in respect of campaign donations that he received, and which the evidence shows pretty clearly he knew he received and yet he claimed were anonymous. Now, if that's permissible in respect of donations for political parties that are meant to be subject to a limit, or even when they're not within the limit, they're meant to be publicly disclosed, why is it that we have a different standard in taxation legislation where people are held to account for the honesty or otherwise of the statements they make as to the receipt of income? Mr. Chairman, this is relevant to Part 3 because it is Part 3 that imposes obligations on people to return certain levels of income and to, as Clayton Cosgroves earlier said, to keep copies of these documents. If they're submitting them electronically, they still have to keep an original copy which bears their signature. And why is that? Because they are held to account for what it is that goes in under their signature. So if that's good enough for taxation, if that's good enough for the tax system, why is it not good enough for rules that are meant to keep New Zealand free of corruption, to keep political operators from being unduly influenced by donations, to keep a level playing field between different candidates so that one person can't cheat on the system by spending more in their election campaign than the nominal limit while someone else complies with the rules? And one of the ways you do that is by, of course, having proper disclosure as to both the amount of donations and in terms of avoiding corruption and avoiding the allegation that people are effectively selling policy for money. They're meant to disclose if they know who the money is coming from. In respect of the tax system, it's clear that you have to make those disclosures. The sorts of excuses that are being used by the Prime Minister John Key, by John Banks in respect of political party donations would not stand the test in respect of this tax legislation, and I ask the Minister to take a call and to explain What is the point of principle that says that we should be stricter in respect of our tax rules and in the enforcement of declarations? What makes in fact, in some ways, the declarations aren't quite as clear because all you're doing is saying this is my income. The other declaration that Mr Banks swore was even more explicit.
David Clark.
Mr Chair, I'm very pleased to take a call at this point.